Okay, if we could start to end the conversations at the tables, and we will start our report out at the table to the right-hand monitor with Colonel Hutchinson and his group. And we will start by hearing the report summary from the leader they have selected to kind of summarize all the conversation that's been happening at each table. So without further ado, go ahead. And if you could, please introduce yourself to the group whenever you report out.
Hello. My name is Paul Lindbergh. I'm up in the upper right-hand corner over here, hiding. Somebody just told me to stand up. Okay. First off, there's no way I'm going to summarize all the conversations that were going on. But we talked a bit about, in our community is Columbia River Gorge, region of North Central Oregon. Dr. Kristen Dillon and I are here from there. We're Culture of Health Prize winners. And we engage our community members and we talk about health equity and a culture of health. Basically in a lot of meetings, but primarily in monthly meetings that are attended by our community members and community service providers, and also through a separate meeting that is our clinical advisory panel for our CCO. And we explicitly talk about social determinants of health, and we explicitly talk about equity in services, and try to and struggle with what that means and how do we address that, and how do we get more community voices, and how do we respond to those community voices. And so we're trying to be very proactive about that when we address those topics. And does anybody have any other things that okay.
Thank you very much. For the next table, we'll go over to Dr. Kimber Bogard's table.
And I am speaking on behalf of this most wonderful and intelligent group. And I will only have 3 main points because I have to follow the wisdom of earlier. But in our group, we had 3 main areas. One was in terms of thinking about the way that you message, in terms of whether it's the internet or going back to more informal, actual personal communication, and in the communities, whether you use mics and on a bus or going to homes, and all the ways that community members successfully engage, and how that we need to think about what's the right vehicle in terms of messaging. And the next point, we talked about a little bit about behaviors. Now, whether they're intentional or unintentional when it comes to health equity, and what that really means, whether it's intentional in terms of actual harm, or is it sometimes unintentional that causes harm, and how whether or not people need feedback on their behaviors that's contributing to the consequences of health equity or health inequity. And then thirdly, we talked a little bit about how we might translate and use language and the power of language, and whether or not you're using words like hope, and if you're using words like opportunity, and how we know that the word empowerment certainly means something other than disparity. So as we move forward to a culture of health versus a culture of unhealth and unwell and sickness, we want to be very careful in how we use our language going forward, and making sure it matches the language and needs of the community.
Thank you very much. And for the next table, we'll go with Andrew Cedar, your table. And you can feel free to keep your summary to about a minute.
We went off on a bit of a tangent. So we talked predominantly, we started off our conversation about social media and talking about how social media has the capacity to mostly be an echo chamber, but it also is a lot of times a place where people highlight challenges and talk about health equity, health inequity. We talked specifically about the need to think about social media. It was really hip for a while, but now it's actually been stratified because the young people are using different types of social media than we're using. I don't even know where to look. I'm like in the mush pot here. And so we talked about how if you're going to get young people on your in your community, you need to know what Snapchat is, and I don't know what that is. And then we also talked about how a lot of people check a box and say, I'm talking to my community about health equity, but I'm not really defining what that is, and I'm also not really talking to the right community members or really going to the hard places, that sort of non-traditional places where you actually need to meet people where they are, and that it's different to talk to one person and explain to them what health equity is. You can very easily kind of connect to one person and say, well, you're sick or you're not sick, and that means one thing, but let's talk about your housing, and let's talk about how housing relates to being sick or not sick. So kind of making those individual connections, and how that's actually, it's a lot harder to do one-on-one, but it's actually a lot more generative and easier than to try to explain to a hospital why they should be adding a housing program. And so those are the main points that we talked about. And then we got sidelined again because it was so interesting.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. And for the next table, we'll go with the NAM communications table, Taos Pueblo table. It's okay. Don't be shy.
I think it's, oh, there it goes. I just wanted to make sure that it was okay that I shared every part of our conversation first. I'm Molly Doyle with NAM Communications, and I talked with the Taos Pueblo folks a lot about their methods of communicating to their community residents, a lot about how many of us use social media to communicate with our communities, but they're not doing that currently due to a policy, and they may be able to do that in the future. We'll see. But how most of their communication to their community members is spoken, in person, verbal communication, and it's based on experience, not really on a textbook or formal report or anything like that. And just kind of how that is different than a lot of other types of communication in communities is really interesting. And I think we also talked about the pros and cons of different approaches, and how with social media and other digital forms of communication, a lot of meaning and nuance can be lost. So it's actually, I think there are pros and cons, to being able to reach larger groups with social and digital communications, but there are trade-offs. So just kind of talked about the pros and cons there. And then Vesna and Peggy had another conversation. Vesna, can I pass it over to you for a quick summary of that, because I don't want to miss that.
I spoke earlier, so I think Peggy should have a chance.
Yeah, I just talked about communicating through community-based planning projects that help to create a culture of health in identified areas. And we're doing that in public housing as a model project, and developing community-based charrettes and asking people to identify the challenges and assets that they need in their public housing to create well-being.
Fantastic. And for the next table, I believe it's the back left over there with Indy Can.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Richardson. I'm with the United Way of San Antonio and Bexar County, and we actually had 3 different conversations going on at our table, and I think I talked too much in our conversation, which is how I ended up with the mic. But we talked a lot about non-traditional places of how to take this information out into the community. We gave some examples of what we did with our Department of Education Promise Neighborhood funded program, and how we used neighborhood community meetings. We used churches who hosted mental health symposiums. We placed peers in non-traditional sites, such as they did door-to-door peer home visiting to talk to families, and we placed them in volunteer income tax preparation sites to talk about Affordable Health Care Act. So a lot of the conversations around the way we looked at health was from a perspective of access and exposure, rather than talking about health in general. We looked at the things that our community didn't have access to, or that the kids in our community weren't exposed to around health. So is there anything that anybody else wants to share? Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For our next, we'll go to the back right over here with Marissa and Lisa.
No, I think I got.
Okay.
Person who talks the most gets. Hi, my name. Hello. 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 I'm really loud. Okay. Hello. Hi. My name is Claudia Booker. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm a home birth mom. And we spent some time at our meeting here today talking about how we can work harder to meet the needs of the community by bringing ourselves to the community and not our community to us. And one of the things we talked about is how come we don't have more people show up? And I mentioned that I know what happens here in DC is that the community sits around and the community members have to do a triage of misery. What incident has happened recently that's just got them all broke up? And maybe this weekend it is the 3 children getting killed in the Southeast, and they don't really have any resilience or energy left to come and talk about sudden infant death right now. It's not that it's not important, but in the triage of misery, it's not at the top of their list. The next thing is rephrasing terms that make sense to the rest of the world, even if we think our definitions are better. For instance, we had a big program here. We spent $12 million on crib death. And we never made any progress because we never checked out what the definition of crib death was for the rest of the community. And we came to find out at the end of the program was told to us by a 17-year-old girl who thought we were all insane. Why'd I put my baby in a crib? My baby's going to die in the crib because crib death is what happens when you put your baby in a crib. And she looked at us like we were the stupidest people who'd ever been born. But we did not vet that. We came with our definition and did not vet what the rest of the community defined that as. And so we have to spend some time now figuring out how do we go to them. Look around in your communities. What do people do with their time? Here in the District of Columbia, you're at the laundromat, you're at the nail salon, you're at the barber shop, you're at the place you go buy hair. You're at those places. And for us to bring the information, once again, the access to where people are and not expect them to take 2 buses in the subway to come and learn from us. We have to once again figure out how to fund walkers and talkers, which is what we used to call our community perinatal health people. We have to go to them. And more important for us who are a faith-based community, we got to figure out how to include in church or directly after church the community health programs we want to push. Every Sunday, leave 5 minutes for someone to get up and talk on an issue of public health and have someone after church be able to have a little program on that. We have to take it to them. We cannot expect them to come to us for health care. Oh, and the last point, we can't all do, each person can't do everything. Find the one thing that keeps you awake at night, grab a hold of that one thing like you're a pit bull, and don't let go until it's finished.
Thank you very much. For the next table, we'll go over to the Push Buffalo table.
Hello. My name is Gena Cozy. I am with Push, and like the other Jennifer, I talked a lot, so that's why I have the mic. I think that a lot of what we talked about was covered today, you know, monthly meetings, being in touch with community. But I think to just kind of piggyback and add to is when I'm a community leader, I literally am one of the leaders. They Aaron and Eric knocked on my door, and that's where I am 13 years later. But one of the things I can bring to the table is, you're right, bring people to the community, right? But at the same time, don't disregard that we don't want to know what health equity is. We don't want to be given another term because we don't understand. We want you to tell us what health equity is. Give us talking points that we can go out and talk to the people around us, but don't disregard the fact that we don't understand, right? I did that a lot. I was like, I don't get it. I'm not college educated. I can't talk about it. That's crap. Yes, we can. And another way is, like, when you bring people in these rooms, next time, not next time for NAM, but I'm saying in general, if we're having these conversations, how many people in here can honestly say they're like me, right? So bring someone with you from the neighborhood, bring the senior citizen, the one from the neighborhood, the educator, and, you know, the researcher and the student, bring them all. Because then these are the places where there's no outlet for me to go and tell every single person in every single kind of world and hat I'm wearing right now, everything I'm learning here, and my head's gonna explode. So honestly, if we're all talking about community, I think we realize at this table, and there's a lot of great panelists that we're literally sitting here, we didn't get to finish hearing about what's going on in Massachusetts because we had a smaller time frame to talk. We had some folks who didn't talk and just handed me the mic. So if we can give enough space to make sure that these conversations happen where it's intriguing just to know who's at the table, then we'll be able to do this. It's not impossible. Just bring everybody to a table and let's not talk about how we can do it. It's very easy. Invite them.
Thank you very much for that insight. For our last table, I believe we're going with Mike White from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Hey, everyone. So Dr. Proctor thought that you had heard enough of him talking on the panel, so I got voluntold to spread this message. But it's a really interesting point. So it's more about sort of the volume and the tenacity of the message rather than the avenue of the communication. And his example was harkening back to RWJF's commitment to childhood obesity. So we've been working for about a decade to reverse trends in childhood obesity, but when we started that whole process, we got a lot of pushback about using that exact term, childhood obesity. People thought it would be too stigmatizing. People thought that it would be sort of too polarizing. But over time, showing people successes, bringing on people that could explain it better in sort of more culturally competent ways, it was the right choice to keep that term. And I think health equity could be similar to that, showing people examples of where it works, and just keep sort of hammering the message home that this is the avenue that we need to take is just as important as finding the right avenue, but just trying to find sort of a widespread. And we also talked about Minnesota and their recent city council election and how it really is, regardless of your politics, it really is evidence of health equity when trans women of color who statistically would have the worst health outcomes and are brought to the table and are setting the table for the agenda going forward. And regardless of their politics, being in that position of power is really a win for health equity.
Well, with that, I want to thank everybody very much for reporting out, and I highly encourage you to exchange that information and keep the conversation going beyond the conclusion of this meeting, because that's where the real change is made. And thank you very much.
Thank you.